Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating historical and textual narrative from the Islamic tradition. We're transported all the way back to the year 619 CE in Mecca, and we're going to explore a profound sequence of events known in the source material as the Year of Grief, which is directly followed by the Night Journey. Now, whether you're deeply familiar with these texts or you're approaching them simply as a student of history, the narrative structure here is, well, it's incredibly gripping. We're going to look objectively at how this text describes a man facing utter, total devastation, and then watch how the narrative completely pivots from the lowest earthly valley to the highest cosmic summit.
So to really grasp the weight of this story, we first have to understand the massive vacuum of power that opened up. We have to ask, what actually happens when a movement loses its only pillars of protection? At this point in the timeline, the Prophet Muhammad had been preaching a message of monotheism for 10 whole years, and he was facing some really intense opposition from the Quraysh leadership in Mecca. But he survived. Why? Because of two massive, practically immovable shields in his life.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how devastatingly twofold that loss was. It was internal and it was external. On one side, you have Khadijah. She was his first wife, the very first believer and truly the anchor of his heart. The texts describe her as a woman who sacrificed her immense wealth and her social standing for his mission, providing him with unparalleled emotional support for 25 years. Then, on the other side, there's Abu Talib, his uncle. Now, even though he never actually embraced the religion himself, Abu Talib was the physical shield. As the head of the Banu Hashim clan, his tribal honor literally prevented the Quraysh from physically assassinating his nephew. But then, within a single, devastating year, both of these pillars died.
Which brings us to the term scholars use for this period, Am al-Huzn, or the Year of Grief. Think about it. Without Khadijah, his internal comfort was just gone. And without Abu Talib, the external restraint of the Quraysh totally vanished. The source material actually notes that physical harassment escalated almost immediately. Plots of physical assassination, which were previously held back by strict tribal protocols, well, they were suddenly being openly discussed. The mission had hit a terrifying wall, and just staying in Mecca was becoming deadly.
Desperate for some kind of political solution, he makes a move. He embarks on a grueling 80-kilometer journey southeast to the prosperous city of Taif. He's seeking an alliance with the powerful Thaqif tribe, but the response is just brutal. He meets with 3 tribal leaders and faces 3 devastating, incredibly contemptuous rejections. And they don't just say no. They send their street boys to mock him, literally pelting him with stones until his feet bleed, and they drive him entirely out of the city.
So now, exhausted, bleeding, he takes refuge in a garden. And ironically, this garden actually belongs to 2 of his Meccan enemies. But right here, the text offers this profound narrative irony. The entire powerful city of Taif just rejected him, right? But he finds comfort in one single person, a Christian servant from Nineveh named Addis. Addis brings him some grapes, hears him speak, and actually recognizes his prophetic lineage, connecting him to the prophet Jonah. He kisses his hands and feet. In this massive sea of rejection, one solitary servant recognizes him.
It's right here in this garden that the text records what scholars universally consider the emotional rock bottom of the prophetic biography. Just look at the quote on this slide. He prays, "O Allah, to you I complain of my weakness, my lack of resources, and my humiliation before the people." I mean, it's a completely stripped-down moment of vulnerability. He describes himself as having absolutely nothing left but his Lord.
But then, immediately after this prayer, the text introduces a cosmic intervention. The angel of the mountains appears with a frankly terrifying offer to crush the city of Taif between the 2 rocky mountains of Makkah, the Akshabain. But instead of revenge, he does something truly astonishing. Bleeding, humiliated, exhausted, he chooses hope. He says he hopes their descendants will one day worship God alone. The sources really highlight this as the ultimate demonstration of prophetic character, choosing immense mercy over vengeance.
Yet, despite that spiritual high, the earthly reality remained incredibly grim. To re-enter Mecca without being murdered on sight, he needed tribal protection. With his uncle dead, he actually had to ask a non-Muslim, a polytheist named Mutim ibn Adi, to heavily arm his sons and publicly escort him back into the city. So yes, he survived, but he was isolated, he was grieving, and he was completely reliant on the charity of an opponent.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how sharply the narrative pivots right here. Just when things are at their absolute bleakest, the text introduces Al-Isra, the night journey. The 70th chapter of the Quran describes this not as some ordinary human road trip, but as a literal divine transport by night, moving him from the sacred mosque in Mecca all the way to the farthest mosque, Al-Aqsa, in Jerusalem.
To make a journey like this, he's provided a mount called the Burak.
And you kind of have to forget the standard artistic depictions you might have seen of a simple winged horse. The source text describes a creature of mind-bending divine physics. Its stride reaches the absolute limit of its sight. It operates entirely outside the framework of our ordinary space-time physics, taking a journey that would normally take weeks by camel and completing it in just a fraction of a single night.
As they travel, the angel Jibril, or Gabriel, has him stop and pray at locations of immense historical and spiritual weight. And the pace here is just breathtaking. They stop at Medina, which will be his future home. They stop at Mount Sinai, the very mountain where Moses spoke to God. They stop at Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus, until finally they arrive at their destination, Jerusalem.
The narrative then describes this massive, totally awe-inspiring gathering at Al-Aqsa. Every single prophet who had ever lived, from Adam to Abraham to Moses to Jesus, they are all assembled there. And in a powerful physical demonstration of the completion of prophethood, Muhammad is asked to step forward and lead every single one of them in prayer. He's also offered a choice of vessels, and he chooses milk over wine. Jibril explains that this choice represents the fitra, or the pure, natural disposition of his message.
But here's the thing, Jerusalem is only the halfway point. The horizontal journey ends and the vertical journey begins. This is Al-Miraj, the ascent. The text describes a literal, vertical journey, moving straight upward from Jerusalem, ascending right through the different layers of the cosmos.
As he ascends through the seven heavens, he encounters those prophets again, but layered sequentially. In the first heaven, there's Adam, carrying the joy and grief of all humanity. In the second, John the Baptist and Jesus. In the third, Joseph, who the text says was given literally half of all human beauty. They go up through Idris and Aaron. Then in the sixth, there's a deeply moving encounter with Moses, who actually weeps, knowing that this new prophet's followers will outnumber his own. And finally, in the seventh heaven, he meets Abraham, the father of prophets, leaning against the heavenly counterpart to the Kaaba.
Now, the scale of this seventh heaven is completely mind-blowing. The text notes that Abraham is leaning against Al-Bayt al-Mamur, a heavenly house of worship. The angel Jibril explains that 70,000 angels enter this house every single day to pray. But because their numbers are so infinitely vast, those 70,000 never return to it again. It's an incredible detail, right? It's designed to showcase just the absolutely incomprehensible size of this cosmic reality.
Finally, they reach a point called Sidrat al-Muntaha, the lote tree of the uttermost boundary. The sources define this as the absolute edge of created existence. It is literally the end of the knowable universe. In fact, it's so definitive that even Jibril, the greatest of angels, has to stop. He cannot cross it. From this point onward, the prophet continues entirely alone into the presence of the divine. And what happens next grounds this massive cosmic event in some highly relatable human emotion. He's given a commandment for his followers, 50 daily prayers. But as he descends, he passes Moses in the sixth heaven. And Moses, speaking from his own difficult experiences leading a pretty tough crowd, essentially tells him, look, human beings are weak. They simply cannot handle 50 prayers. He urges him to go back and negotiate. So they do this repeatedly, reducing the burden by tens until the number is brought way, way down.
So the crucial point is, after continuous back and forth, he feels too embarrassed to ask for any further reductions, and the number settles at 5. A divine voice announces that the obligation is finalized at 5 daily prayers, but, and this is huge, out of immense divine generosity, those 5 will actually carry the spiritual reward of the original 50. The core daily practice of millions of people today, according to the text, was born out of this specific, deeply merciful negotiation at the very edge of the universe.
The very next morning, the narrative crashes right back down to earth in Mecca. When he tells the people what happened, the Quraysh just erupt in mockery. I mean, they're thinking, how could a man travel to Jerusalem and the heavens in a single night? It sounds absurd to them. But his closest companion, Abu Bakr, doesn't hesitate for a second. With definitive loyalty, he simply says, if he said it, then I believe it. Because of this unwavering support in the face of intense public ridicule, Abu Bakr is forever given the title Al-Siddiq, which means the truthful.
Now, to silence the critics, the Meccan merchants, who had actually traveled to Jerusalem before, they demand he describe the city to them, trying to catch him in a lie. The text says that Jibril literally lifted a vision of Jerusalem right before his eyes there in Mecca. He flawlessly described it gate by gate, building by building to those merchants. They couldn't find a single error. It was undeniable geographical proof presented directly to his interrogators.
So let's synthesize all of this. Why does this source text matter today, and what should we take away from it? First, it sets up a really powerful paradigm that the darkest hours often precede the greatest divine responses. Second, the daily prayer, the Salah, is framed not as some heavy burden, but as a mercifully negotiated gift. Third, it firmly establishes the historical and spiritual sanctity of Al-Aqsa. And lastly, and perhaps most profoundly, it reveals a deeply psychological reality. Sometimes God responds to overwhelming grief not by immediately changing the external situation, but by vastly expanding the person's internal perspective.
Which brings us to our final thought. The text presents a man who went from bleeding in a lonely garden to standing at the absolute boundary of the universe. And it kind of forces us to ask, if the deepest earthly grief can lead to the highest cosmic ascension, how might your own darkest valleys be preparing you for a summit you cannot yet see? It's a truly remarkable narrative arc from the source material that leaves us with plenty to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep seeking knowledge, and I'll catch you next time.